Thank you, Robin. I'd say you mastered that etude. Today, our society leader, Hugh Taft-Morales, will explore whether we can transcend a superficial appropriation of Native American culture, which is found in some of our Thanksgiving traditions. His talk today is titled Indigenous Wisdom, Respect and Appropriation. Hugh.
Thank you, Michael. Welcome, everyone. So today, as we begin Native American History Month, as we come towards Thanksgiving, I want to acknowledge that we are all gathered here on land, indigenous land, taken from the Lenape people, one of the oldest tribes, a peace-loving and generous group that helped early European colonists survive. More specifically, Philadelphia is on the land of the Uluwank people of the Turkey clan of the Lenape. So what was that? What did I just do? Most people call that a land acknowledgement. It's something that's increasingly common, and it's meant to recognize and respect indigenous people as traditional stewards of the land. It acknowledges colonialism, both in the past and continuing on today, which disempowers Native American people. Now, not all indigenous people like land acknowledgements. Kevin Gover, a citizen of the Pawnee Nation, explained that, quote, if it becomes routine, or worse yet, is strictly performative, then it has no meaning at all. The writer Graham Wood in The Atlantic added that it can be little more than moral exhibitionism. He says that, quote, these statements relieve the speaker and the audience of the responsibility to think about indigenous people, at least until the next public event. So land acknowledgements can become also a move to innocence. That's a term that I learned from Sarah Teelmans at a 2019 ethical culture workshop up in New York. These moves for innocence are superficial words or changes that ignore settler colonial heritage. They offer narratives that try to reconcile settler guilt and complicity without giving up land or power. Though I try to avoid it, I'm sure I do make these moves to innocence. So to do more than just feel good about the words that we speak, we could ask people to contribute financially to groups that are led by indigenous people, like I did last year at our same event, the Association on American Indian Affairs. I know some of you gave to that. But even that feels a bit superficial, because how much does it do to really heal centuries of wounds? Now, besides our even land acknowledgements, a form of appropriation. I mean, am I appropriating a history of suffering in order to simply make this event have an air of solemnity, a sense of depth? It doesn't seem right to do that. So today I'm going to explore the dangers of appropriation and the importance of respect, and I don't know if I'll succeed in not appropriating. I'm going to briefly look at appropriations of different types, of land, of bodies, of culture, of narratives, and of wisdom. And then I'll spend most of the time exploring respect, but not as you might expect I would. I'm not going to talk about respect that non-Indigenous people offer to Indians, as important as it is. I want to focus on the respect that Native American wisdom expresses for the environment, for nature, for our planet, as reflected particularly in Robin Wall Kimmerer's book, Braiding Sweetgrass. How many of you have read that? Pretty popular, okay. If you want to do a book discussion, let me know on that. Now, appropriation. Most of us here know the paternalistic and hegemonic nature of settler colonialism. Those of my generation grew up being taught idealized narratives of generous natives saving grateful Europeans with their food and survival skills. And while that first Thanksgiving meal did actually occur, without the context of genocidal land theft, it's a distorted narrative, right? Well, in 1823, the U.S. Supreme Court justified the land theft with something called the Doctrine of Discovery. Now, this doctrine came that you don't control the land unless you exploit its resources completely. So white people judged that indigenous people did not do this and forced them off their land. And powerful men like Andrew Jackson or General Sheridan or Theodore Roosevelt basically said the only good Indian is a dead Indian. And that led to an indigenous Holocaust. Now, progressive forces did step in with less barbarous alternatives, choosing the slogan, quote, "kill the Indian to save the man." That was considered an improvement. I guess it is. Only Native Americans who were stripped of their culture would be allowed to exist in this country. This occurred with the 1887 Dawes Act that ended collective ownership of land and forced Native Americans to get involved in private plot farming in our economy. Younger Indians were kidnapped and placed in boarding schools like the Carlisle Indian Industrial School, and many of those who were denied their family and their cultural legacy succumbed to addiction and poverty and suicide. So it goes on and on and on. You know this story. And a century later, we still stumble while we try to heal these wounds. For example, Senate Bill 1723 would establish a Truth and Healing Commission on Indian boarding school policies, so just a little piece of it, but that's stuck in the Committee on Indian Affairs. If passed, it would investigate the harm done by more than 400 federal boarding schools that existed up till the 1960s. Momentum's beginning to grow about compensating indigenous people for land grabs, like the land grabs that occurred due to the Morrill Act in 1862, which took land from many indigenous areas and built community colleges and agricultural colleges. The University of Minnesota is one college that's now feeling pressure to acknowledging the claims of those that once lived on what is now campus land. So in California and elsewhere, small parcels of land are being given to Native people. Now, maybe the new film Killers of the August Moon, which I saw yesterday, will spur people to compensate for the harm done. That film shows how bodies and land were woven together in Oklahoma, leading to the marriage and murder of Osage women. Virginia kept land out of Native American hands by simply erasing their very identity. The 1924 Racial Integrity Act in Virginia eliminated the legal category of Native Americans. It forced people to choose between being either white or colored. So it facilitated the appropriation of land by simply erasing Native Americans. Similarly, results flowed out of the creation of our national park system, which I have always praised as a wonderful thing, without realizing how often those parks were built on indigenous land. Because when people saw the wilderness shrinking, they began to want to protect it at the expense of indigenous people. So similarly, I taught American history for 25 years, and I would teach about the New Deal and all the great programs like the Grand Coulee Dam, which helped many Americans survive and provided electricity and flood control. But I didn't teach alongside that the fact that it and 60 other dams in the Columbia watershed destroyed the natural environments that sustained salmon culture for many native tribes. It was an example of ecocide, a term that I just learned, which means the destruction of landscapes through capitalist models of development. Ecocide. Well, Dina Gileo-Whitaker of the Colville Confederated Tribe recently spoke at the Washington Ethical Society. You can listen to her talk online. And she talked about how baby boomers were raised in this culture full of ugly stereotypes and cowboy and Indian movies. So when the 60s counterculture came along, they adopted various signifiers of indigenous life like long hair and moccasins and beads. I thought that was a step forward, that was showing respect. Unfortunately, hippie culture, which is what Gileo-Whitaker calls it, distorted native cultures and lumped them all together in one indigenous bucket. That's Indian life. It created a trope about the ecological Indian, this one sort of idea of what an Indian's all about, and it ignored the diversity and the uniqueness of native people and their very particular sense of identity tied to their local environment, which we overlook when we create these stereotypes. It also ignores the social justice issues and sovereignty issues that they're arguing about now. Now, the corporate appropriation of Native Americans is on display at the National Museum of American Indian in Washington, D.C., and that museum's gotten some criticism for focusing too much on art and culture and not enough on genocide and sovereignty. But the installation, full of corporate logos and mascots, is striking. Because in a country where less than 1% of the population claims Native Americans' identity, their names and their images are omnipresent, from geographic names to household goods to military weapons, right? Everywhere you turn. And that serves a purpose. Comanche author Paul Chatt-Smith explained this in a short film called What is Thanksgiving, which I can send you the link to. It's very short. It explains how that comfortable Thanksgiving narrative about our brunch in the forest with Indians, as he calls it, wasn't told much during the first 100 years of our history because it wasn't needed. Because the narratives that most Americans were comfortable with were two types of narratives. One, Americans were convinced of the righteousness of our uplifting the savages, on the one hand, and on the other hand, the necessity of killing dangerous warriors threatening innocent white people. So those two somewhat different narratives dominated that's all we needed to explain what was going on. Only later, in the late 1800s, when the Indian threat was practically eliminated, did we begin to promote this harmonizing narrative. We swept the ugly history under the rug and embraced the story that, in Smith's words, we're neighborly. We want this to work out. Won't you join us for Thanksgiving? Now, the corporate appropriation of these images and names, according to Smith, communicated, quote, we are in your head. We're in your pantry. We're in your garage. Thanksgiving says, however imperfectly we're remembering the Indians, we're remembering the Indians. Main Street white culture says, you're a part of us. You have a place at the table, and for that we give thanks. Now, with those dynamics in mind, there's a lot there. I'm going to share some of my thoughts about the wisdom of respect for the environment that I hope does not appropriate, insult, or distort, although I'm sure I do to a degree. All right. Western specialized approach to knowledge, where we have academic silos, has brought us great technological advancements. But given the climate crisis, I do wonder, did we miss the forest for the trees? Right? Is our knowledge incomplete? Now, Native American authors of the book Keepers of the Earth observe, quote, the artificial distinctions between fields of study, with natural sciences alone being divided into botany, zoology, geology, astronomy, and hundreds of other areas, can lead to knowledge that is fragmented. It's like what you learn by dissecting a frog. You know the parts, but you cannot put them together to understand the animal. And in cutting the frog apart, you have killed it, end quote. So, Have we killed the frog? Right? Are we destroying the natural environment because we do not appreciate the more holistic indigenous wisdom? Is our approach to knowledge, our epistemology, to blame? Now, Gilo Whitaker uses a term, again, that I had never heard before, epistemicide, the killing of knowledge systems. Okay? Like genocide that wipes out people, epistemicide wipes out ways of understanding the world that might actually help us survive. So over the centuries, U.S. policies actually did outlaw indigenous wisdom because it made certain practices and rituals meant to educate future generations illegal. So Kimmerer, who is a biologist and member of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation, went into our siloed academic world, and she sought more profound and unified approaches to nature. And she writes about that in her book. Braiding Sweetgrass, which is subtitled Indigenous Wisdom, Scientific Knowledge, and the Teaching of Plants, impressed me greatly. She weaves together her own Native American ancestry with science and life lessons about being a mom and a citizen. She inspired me to think about respect not in terms of land acknowledgments, but as it's expressed in relationship between indigenous groups and nature. And as the climate grows ever angrier, this respect is crucial for our survival. Now, Kimmerer carried an early appreciation of the unity of knowledge into college. When she applied for a botany program, she was concerned that they were going to focus too much on depth and not enough on breadth. And she wondered whether this isn't another example of breaking our knowledge into pieces. It made me wonder whether the reality is reflected in this Ojibwe prayer that we've read here on previous Thanksgiving times. It goes, "Grandfather, look at our brokenness. We know that in all of creation, only the human family has strayed from the sacred way. We know that we are the ones who are divided, and we are the ones who must come back together to walk in the sacred way. Grandfather, Sacred One, teach us love, compassion, and honor that we may heal the earth and we may heal each other." Now, I'm not drawn to prayers and myths, as many of you know, but that prayer resonates for me. As did the myth of Sky Woman that begins the book, of Sky Woman falling from the earth, and thanks to a turtle and strawberries and tobacco, she finds firm footing and nutrition and medicines. And Sky Woman develops a deep respect for nature. Now, Kimmerer points out that this is radically different from the biblical framework of the Bible, where Eve learns guilt, not gratitude, by what she gets from the earth, the apple. In a section titled The Council of Pecans, or pecans, depending on whether you're from Georgia, gratitude extends to nature's abundant bounty. Kimmerer says that from the perspective of many indigenous people, the gifts from the land and nature should never be commodified. They should be appreciated as gifts. And that can fuel a gift economy where reciprocity matters more than profits. What a concept. Now, in fact, Kimmerer told Krista Tippett on Being that she likes the term reciprocity more than sustainability. I use sustainability quite a bit. But she says that she thinks that sustainability implies that we want to keep the earth functioning so that it can continue giving to us. Whereas reciprocity implies a give and take of respect between humans and the environment. Now, reciprocity is not in the worldview of Wendigo. Wendigo is a mythological monster Kimmerer talks about who craves more and more but is never satisfied. This addiction to consumption creates a scarcity mindset, which is paradoxical. very evident in our culture. We have so much, but we want more and more and more. Now, I've heard people living in cultures with much less than we have express incredible abundance. My kids who went to El Salvador on volunteer projects were housed in homes where they gave our children everything because they believed they had lots to give. They expressed what Kimmerer called an attitude of gratitude that runs against the grain of our culture that teaches scarcity. Capitalism teaches scarcity so that we buy what is promised to make us whole, end quote. So generosity can keep us from getting caught in a scarcity mindset. Kimmerer explains that different cultural approaches to gift giving shows that. I mean, while many subcultures in the West value gifts that are shiny and clean and expensive, in Kimmerer's upbringing, what was most valued were gifts that actually were given from one generation to the next. So that when she would receive a dress that her grandmother wore, that wasn't a hand-me-down, that was an honored thing to receive. It brought the essence and the history of the grandmother to that child. Kind of reframes regifting, right? These cultural differences might somewhat stem from different evaluations of rights versus responsibilities. Kimmerer writes, in Western thinking, private land is understood to be a bundle of rights, whereas in gift economy, property has a bundle of responsibilities attached to it. We can't ignore the lessons about responsibilities for this web of interdependent relationships that is in our biosphere. Kimmerer writes actually about how the trees offer us what she calls ecosystem services for free. Unlike city services that you have to pay for, trees give us cooling, shade, flood control, air purification, and we don't have to pay for it. So that we need to use that to learn about the mutuality between nature and ourselves. Kimmerer says, because good communities don't make themselves. You have to nurture them. Now, this mutuality is evident even in the structure of Indigenous language. In one of the most fascinating chapters called Learning the Grammar of Animacy, Kimmerer points out that English is an object-dominated language. Only 30% of our words are verbs. But in Kimmerer's native language of Potawatomi, 70% of the words are verbs. So you don't just talk about a mountain or a bay. You talk about being a mountain or being a bay. Natural objects are animate. Now, is it just a coincidence that English cultures that portray animals and plants as objects primarily consume, own, and manipulate them? Is it a coincidence that in languages that treat natural objects as subjects, people embrace respect, mutuality, and ecological harmony? Now, I'm a rational skeptic, so I admit I resist some of this. I resist anthropomorphism, giving human characteristics to non-human things. When Kimmerer writes about how plants produce fruits for our use, I'm uncomfortable with the implication that the fruit is produced so that we can use it. Similarly, I'm skeptical when Kimmerer claims that, quote, nature loves her. But I'm trying to be more open. Kimmerer denies, after all, that she's ascribing human characteristic to nature. That was one lesson I took. I thought she was. She says she's simply appreciating what plants have to offer. She says plants have plant knowledge. Now, most people, myself included, generally look down at plants in a way, but Kimmerer really admires them. She actually says that she has photosynthesis envy. I mean, wouldn't it be incredible to be able to take water, air, and light and create food and medicine to share with the world? Well, indigenous wisdom was largely absent from Kimmerer's academic experience. Time and again, she ran into resistance to anything that didn't fit into preconceived academic frameworks. So when she was applying to school, she was asked by the interviewer why she wanted to study botany. And she said she wanted to know why the yellow goldenrod and the purple asters looked so beautiful together. Science is not about beauty, they told her. The gatekeepers of the academy insisted that science was only objective. But Kimmerer believes that overly strict separation between the subjective and the objective makes Western academics reductionist and materialistic. There's more to nature, Kimmerer insisted. Now, Kimmerer did praise the objective and rational aspects of Western science, but she believes that we also have to access intuitive and spiritual knowledge. Again, not things that I tend to do a lot. Intuitive, yeah, spiritual less so, but again, I'm trying to learn. I do worry that when you're crafting social policy, you can't draw too much on intuitive and spiritual knowledge. It's got to be something that we share more, because otherwise you can get destructive irrationality, right? It's a bit of a tightrope. But Kimmerer does speak optimistically about what she calls heart-based science. Scientists, she notices, are beginning to shift from strictly mechanical paradigms to ones that better appreciate relationships. So she notes how many botanists are not asking how do plants work? They're asking, what can plants tell us? Does that shift indicate greater humility and openness to subjective wisdom? I think so. Can we learn from the aesthetic connection between goldenrods and asters? Can we appreciate what Kimmerer calls the lived reciprocity inherent in the pairing of purple and gold? It was, she said, quote, an architecture of relationships, of connections that I yearned to understand. When she was a professor, she had a student who was interested in studying this architecture of relationships. The student proposed a study of whether or not human harvesting of sweetgrass would hurt the sweetgrass growth. The college committee that was in charge of approving the study was skeptical of the value of this research because they said, everyone knows harvesting hurts a population. The study went forward, the committee was surprised. The harvesting actually increased the amount of sweetgrass because it thinned out the grass, allowing more sunshine and air to improve the grass's reproductive capacity. And that uncovered this mutuality between sweetgrass and us. This mutuality that indigenous people have known for generations. Now, this mutuality, I believe, is taught at Camp Linden. Am I correct? How many of you know the three sisters? Right? Well, the three sisters are corn, beans, and squash, and you can correct me if I'm wrong on this. But when planted together, they facilitate each other's growth because of their relationships. The corn reaches high and gets enough of the sunshine. It allows the beans to crawl up the pole so they can get sunshine. The beans return important nutrients to the soil, which helps all of them grow. Squash covers the ground with broad leaves, which minimizes evaporation of moisture and stunts weeds. So this nice bonus is that the three plants give us a nice mix of starch, legume, and fruit for our nutrition. But when Europeans first saw the superficial disarray of Indian gardens with these three products fumbling over each other, they drew an incorrect conclusion. Kimmerer explained, they inferred that the savages did not know how to farm. To their minds, a garden meant straight rows of a single species, not a three-dimensional sprawl of abundance. We often miss these lessons offered by nature. I know I do. I mean, there was one lesson that I loved of what Kimmerer calls life at its basic. What do you think that is? What's the most basic form of life you can think of? She says it's lichen. Lichen. Okay? I saw it as a very low form of life. It can be pretty. It's on rocks. But they have no roots, no stems, no seeds, no leaves. But it flourishes thanks to having two completely distinct parts: fungus and algae. The fungus offers a cover and an anchor to protect the algae, and the algae produces sugar that feeds the fungus. They work together to survive in the harshest of environments where no other life form can exist. Kimmerer says it explains how lichens are born from reciprocity. They remind us of the enduring power that rises from mutualism, from the sharing of the gifts carried by each species. It's humbling to appreciate that we have so much to learn from things that grow on rocks. Our proud and noble species prefers to see ourselves as smarter, but indigenous people seem more able to learn. And I wonder if the rest of us can learn. Can we embrace a deeper knowledge that involves our emotions and changes our behavior? Can we learn? I'll admit I'm a little pessimistic. We haven't learned well in the past. But there's hope in the story of Onondaga Lake that I'll tell you as a conclusion. Up in New York State. This lake is one of the most sacred indigenous sites and one of the most polluted. Due to high levels of mercury, swimming was banned in the 1940s, fishing was banned in the 1970s. It's a broken ecosystem. But the Onondaga people are working to address the brokenness both of their hearts and of that environment. They understand that action is a path to healing, something that is central to ethical culture. Action helps heal. But Kimmerer adds that they don't believe that two wrongs make a right, so they're not asking the non-indigenous people to move off the lake. They're actually asking the people on the lake to adopt a caring attitude and to help in ecological restoration. Now, they're nurturing a harmonious relationship between indigenous and traditionally Western scientists, and the biological sciences are becoming more effective there. The lake's getting cleaner, fish, eagles are returning, but progress is not going to be long-lived if we don't make a more fundamental change. I think what we need is what Joanna Macy, many of you know her writing, calls a great turning, and realizing that ecological restoration requires spiritual restoration. Kimmerer says that when land is, quote, just real estate, then restoration looks very different than if the land is a source of subsistence, economy, and a spiritual home. Restoring the land for production of natural resources is not the same as renewal of land as cultural identity. Now, as somebody who has benefited from settler colonialism, I want to help repair the harm done. I want to avoid cheap cultural appropriation. It's insufficient to offer land acknowledgments. So what's going to make more of a concrete difference? We got to figure that out. I don't have the answer, but I do have a great list compiled by Joan Johnson Lewis, ethical culture leader, that's on 2 chairs back here and up there, that offers you a whole bunch of things that you might be able to pick out. Pick what would work for you. Pick one thing that you could do. Learn about. Change your habits over. Kimmerer understands that our mainstream American culture is all tied up with seizing the land and harnessing nature, about power and control. They run through our settler narratives, they center European imperialism, they erase indigenous people. As they destroy the natural world, we suffer what Kimmerer calls species loneliness. We're separated from the hills and the forests. Can we reclaim that relationship? Can we gain the strength that comes from connection to nature? N. Scott Momaday, a Native American poet, writes, I think contemporary white Americans are more culturally deprived than the Indian. And maybe it's because if we appreciate how the environment feeds us, our bodies and our spirits will be able to change. Franz Galt, who did a whole bunch of ecological restoration on the Oregon coast, wrote about having, quote, a personal relationship with the land and its living things. In working with the land, he said, he wrote about this loving relationship that grew between him. He said, it was as if I discovered a part of myself. In restoring the forest, I restored myself. Can we do that? Can we avoid being Wendigo, that monster of consumption? Can we create an environment where harvest doesn't destroy? We can probably still offer land acknowledgements, but we have to acknowledge that contemporary Native Americans demand restoration and sovereignty. We're more likely to do so if we nurture gratitude for being part of the environment. Our identity is enhanced by our relationship with what's around us. I hope it'll better help us to understand that real wealth is having enough to share. Thanks very much.